Coming up, sovereignty and climate change are front and center for Indigenous lands, plus a new children's book from Red Lake Ojibwe citizens. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amadawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start in Louisiana, where the ownership of sacred land is being restored. The Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana and the city of Marksville signed an agreement this week. It transfers ownership of the Marksville Historic State Park back to the tribe. The park is located on burial grounds containing ancestral remains from Tunica Biloxi citizens that once inhabited the area. Chairman Marshall Pierwright says tribal leadership worked diligently to restore ownership for years and is pleased to once again be the caretakers of his nation's lands. Moving forward, the tribe plans to update and restore the lands, as well as increase education on the cultural significance of the park to the public. The National Indian Health Board celebrated its 50th anniversary. The nonprofit works as a united voice for Indigenous healthcare policy. Here is ICT's Polly Dinetclaw with the story.
The National Indian Health Board is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and this year its conference is in its backyard. The theme of the gathering is to look back at the last decades of policy and advocacy.
I was active as an officer of the National Congress of American Indians in the 70s and many years subsequent to that, but knew the first chair of the National Indian Health Board, Howard Tommy, and heard their first executive director of the National Indian Health Board, Jake Whitecrow, on many occasions while we were advocating, the betterment of Indian health and the provision of necessary care to our people. So that's why I'm here, to celebrate all the good things that have been done for the tribes and programs throughout the decades.
This November will be officially 50 years since the organization was founded. Stacy Bolin is the CEO of the nonprofit and says she's thankful for the path laid by those who came before her.
Right now, when you think about the National Indian Health Board being 50 years in existence, and you look at the amazing leaders who came before us, the ancestors that came before us to put us on the ground we're standing on right now.
Bolin has big hopes as she and others carry the organization's legacy forward. One of those hopes is to solidify mandatory funding for the Indian Health Service.
Number two, for the immediate, we need to pass legislation that's pending in Congress right now to make sure the tribes have full access to public health emergency funding.
Experts say health equity for Indigenous Americans continues to be an uphill battle. Currently, IHS is massively underfunded, and that affects the 2.6 million people who depend on it daily. Right now, the health agency would need over $30 billion to fix this issue, compared to the $6 billion it gets annually.
We already paid for it with our treaties. The trust obligation is intact. We paid for it with our lives, our culture, our land. We paid for this. This is not help. This is owed.
In Washington, D.C., Polly Dinetclaw, ICT News.
In Idaho, a citizen of the Shoshone Bannock Nation is chasing a career in acting. Lashane Havawa is in 2 upcoming film productions that include a small role in Marvel's Echo series and Kevin Costner's Horizon. According to Showband News, Lashane caught the acting bug in high school when he tried out and got a part in the musical Guys and Dolls. The young performer saw calls for actors on social media. He bravely sent in his audition and was immediately cast in the Marvel series Echo. Lashane spoke with ICT about his first time on set and being directed by Kevin Costner.
It's really cool doing all this stuff, and you meet the actors, and then you don't really get to meet the main actors, but you get to see them walk by you, and you're just like, oh, that's amazing. And then like you have the director talking to you, like Kevin, he was talking to me on some of the stuff I had to do, which was pretty cool. And he got to know my name, and I was like, wow, that's amazing.
Fellow tribal citizens Stormy Perdash and Cree Burnett were also part of the Costner film, which has a release date of summer 2023. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. There's a new Red Lake Ojibwe book that teaches traditional values through a journey of 3 cousins. Elizabeth Barrett wrote it and Jonathan Thunder illustrated the book. But the inspiration actually came from Elizabeth's uncle, Thomas Barrett.
See me quits for my life, cause creator hold it down through the days and the nights. And I'ma tell you now that this native hella proud, so I say it loud. And I gotta burn sage when I'm starting out my day, cause I am Ojibwe, war paint on my face, man, I'm feeling really ace. When they ask about my race, hey, I'ma say Mac soup and wild rice, I got the whole family grubbing. It's powwow time, so the whole tribe buzzing. Everybody giving daps, I got about 100 cousins, let me tell you something. And I show my people love, give my grandmother hugs, and we give respect.
Thomas joins us today, and he's the CEO of the Red Lake Boys and Girls Club. Here's the story of Mishkiki Road, the 7 grandfather teachings.
This actually was born during the early days of the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, people were supposed to isolate at home. So for us at the Boys and Girls Club, we didn't have kids coming to our building. So we had to get creative with our programming. And we were doing virtual programming. We were sending activity packets home to the kids. And one of the activities was create your own book. So we would have a title page and just, empty pages for them to draw, to write a story, color, whatever it was. And the common themes we were getting back was things around our Ojibwe culture. So, the team got together and said, to further this children's book project, let's do it about the 7 grandfather teachings. And the 7 grandfather teachings are part of Anishinaabe culture and other indigenous cultures as well. And they're respect, truth, wisdom, honesty, humility, courage, and love. So we eventually partnered up with Elizabeth. I know she's my niece, so I know of her writing capabilities. She was fresh off graduating from Dartmouth University in English literature. And John Thunder, he's painted murals for our Boys and Girls Clubs. We have 2 Boys and Girls Clubs, one in the community of Red Lake and another in the community of Penema. And he's painted, different murals in those gyms to kind of bring more, color and highlight our buildings in that way. So they got together, created the book, and it was Elizabeth who sent it over to the Minnesota Historical Society, and they eventually published it, and now it's out there for the world.
The reaction to Thunder's illustrations has been surprising.
I guess some things I've heard from the kids is they like there's little egg the like hints of Red Lake in there, like the Red Lake Nation flag is in there, the Red Lake water tower that you see in our town here is in it. Jonathan Thunder in his unique artistic way dropped those little Easter eggs in there. And then it's cool to see that they're gaining some knowledge about Ojibwe culture in that way. And it's even more cool to see non-Indigenous or non-Ojibwe, kids and people pick up this book and they can learn a piece of our culture in this way. So it's really empowering to see young people read this book and learn about their culture.
That was Thomas Barrett Jr. And now to Nebraska, where the Okmulgee tribe has returned. In 1833, the tribe was forced to move to Oklahoma's Indian Territory. Now tribal citizens are being honored. Lincoln's mayor and the Native community welcomed them with a proclamation and celebration. ICT's Shirley Snavy reports.
It's very significant and very spiritual, very sacred to us that we are welcomed here by the citizens of Lincoln, the mayor of Lincoln, that we're able to walk on these lands that once our ancestors walked on themselves.
Mayor Larian Gaylor Baird signed the proclamation at the Center for Great Plains Studies. Its director, Margaret Jacobs, was instrumental in welcoming the tribe home. Jacobs and Oglala citizen Kevin Aberesk are producing a movie centering on land return.
We wanted to do something with the original peoples of this area, the Okmulgee. So we started out as a project that was just about making media, podcast, films, but we really wanted to expand into actual actions.
How do you invite a people who've had their connection to their ancestral homelands severed by all the traumas that our people have suffered all across this land? How do you find a way to start to reconnect them to the rivers and the hills and the streams and all these beautiful things that you were forced to leave behind so many years ago?
In Lincoln, Nebraska, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
The prestigious Udall Fellowship is awarded to Native students in healthcare. Tammy Livermont is Oglala Lakota and pursuing her MD at the University of Minnesota Medical School.
The Udall Foundation was originally established in honor of a couple of different congressmen who committed much of their political careers to advocating for tribal health, tribal policy, and they have the undergraduate scholarship, which I was awarded in undergrad, another prestigious award that I did not expect to receive. And this is really just a extension of that, really an award that they created for graduate students who are committed to supporting and uplifting health and wellness in Indian country through policy.
Sovereignty is at the center of Livermont's studies.
When you look at Indian country, you often hear about health disparities, but really at the center of my work at this point is really about self-determination when it comes to healthcare in our communities. And for so long, the federal government has been running and delivering healthcare to our communities, and we know how to best care for our own people. So when it comes to policy, for me, it's about empowering and providing all tribal nations the tools and the things that they need to determine their own healthcare services in the best way, deliver the best services necessary to meet the needs of their communities.
At the start of the pandemic, Livermont was a tribal liaison with the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board.
I'm actually at the Oyate Health Center, which is the new tribally run clinic that the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board works at. But prior to going to med school, like you said, I was a tribal liaison, and it was an amazing and really life-altering experience. I took that role prior to graduating from my master's program, knowing that I wanted to come back and serve the tribes in the Great Plains area. And it was the second day of my job that they declared COVID as a national emergency. And so it was boots on the ground immediately. And it was just an honor to work with tribal leaders, tribal public health professionals, and also really serve as a liaison between our tribal nations and state and federal partners to ensure that our tribes were allowed to exert their tribal sovereignty and also get resources to our communities.
That was Tammy Livermont. Native people make up 1.9% of the population in Washington state, but when you look at the state's prison, that number rises to 5%. We go now to a story about a state penitentiary where Native people are doing their part to stay connected to culture. From the tiny tots to the golden age, dancers entered the arena. This year was the first time the Washington State Penitentiary held its annual powwow since 2019. The gathering is a major highlight of the year for the Native people who are incarcerated here. Joey Brooks, who is Lakota, said this was his fourth powwow at the medium security prison in Walla Walla. He says the powwow is a way to show his family that people in prison can change. Talon Saliskin hadn't seen his mother, Edith, in almost 10 years. That is, until the powwow. She's not able to drive that well, the Yakima citizen said. This year, Talon had no intention of dancing. He just wanted to sit with his mom all day. Washington state officials first allowed powwows at state penitentiaries 50 years ago. It came with religious rights being protected by the Constitution and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But there are still many challenges to holding an event like this. This year, organizers say they were only able to allow children after a legal organization paid for extra security and all of the food. It was worth it for people like Jared Arrington, who is Quinault. Jared oversees the prison's medicine garden. He tends to the plants that are used for medicines and smudging. Back at the powwow, beaded medallions and painted drums lined the tables. They are gifts handmade by the prisoners for their friends and families. And by the end of the day, almost every attendee was gifted something to take home. The video from that story came from our friends at _news. With recent reports of Indigenous collections found at universities in North Dakota and Kansas, we are seeing more Native people and tribal nations taking control of their stories and archives. Alexander Soto is doing just that. He's the director of the Labriola National American Indian Data Center at Arizona State University's library. I interviewed Soto earlier this week. Let's watch.
There is actually an Indigenous library within Arizona State University library system. And so we have two locations, one on the main campus in the Hayden Library and the second one out on the West Campus in the Fletcher Library.
And I understand you actually have different types of collections. Maybe tell us about those.
Yeah, so our collections span whether that's archival or distinctive collections, more or less rare, unique books, but also we have an OpenStax circulating collection for students to check out. A lot of the newer titles are more from contemporary, Indigenous writers, poets, creatives. This is really good to have a show of Native books within libraries, let alone at the university. So.
And a lot of that you mentioned is archival. Maybe tell us about some of your favorite things that are in those archives.
Yeah, within our collection scope, so we have one of our archival manuscript collections, so that would consist of papers, like the typical gray box you're probably accustomed to seeing in movies. And then also we have the unique, rare archival books, some of which are just could be ranged from community publications on the reservation. So for example, one of the favorite ones I like to have or to view is ones from my own community of Okmulgee Nation. That's where I'm originally from. And just to see kind of that, history of language work, cultural work dating back from the 60s and 70s, and then how that's evolved throughout the decades to now. And so a lot of the cultural revitalization material I tend to gravitate towards. But in addition to that, just seeing old tribal newspapers is pretty cool. I mean, there were some papers in there that I was unaware from the Gila River Indian community from back in the 70s. And so when you're in the archive, you just kind of always discover, and it's just kind of a rabbit hole. So you look for something, and then it translates to, or goes to something else. But yeah, it just depends on your background and what your interest is. So.
I mean, you mentioned that your tribal nation is, of course, using these archives for things like language revitalization. Mm-hmm. Is this collection and are the collections in general open to just students and faculty of ASU, or is that something that's open to other people?
Being that we're a public university, it is open to the public at large. In that sense, for the archival material, you do have to make an appointment, whether you're a student or community member, just because of the nature of it. You have to make an appointment for a reading room and meet a librarian like myself or other librarians, just so you can have that time and have the time you need to look through it. But as far as the circulating books, that's something mainly for the students, but we are looking towards ways to make that collection more accessible to the public. So.
And is there information about tribes that are not located in Arizona? Can you maybe give us an idea of the scope of items that you have about Native communities?
Yeah, so within our collection scope does focus initially in the local regional areas, so starting on O'odham land, being that ASU is located in O'odham and Peepash territory, but beyond that, kind of stretching out through the 23 tribal nations here in Arizona. is kind of the bulk of our scope, but from there, the Southwest is large and more into like Indian country as a whole in the U.S. But we do have materials from Canada, Hawaii, New Zealand, across the world really on Indigenous peoples, and it just depends on, of course, faculty needs, student needs. We definitely want to purchase or acquire anything that's Indigenous focused, but we do want to keep in mind that we are here in the desert, Sonoran Desert, and the lands that we're on, and also to Mexico too. In particular, we do have another O'odham tribe that's not recognized, but is still sovereign nation, the Hiachit O'odham, the sand desert sand O'odham, and so it's good to have that even within our collections too, because there's materials there.
Now to Macon, Georgia, where Muskogee citizens gathered recently to celebrate their culture and to advocate for their sacred lands to be protected. ICT's Pacey Smith-Garcia has the story.
A community gathering. That was the site in Macon, Georgia earlier this month. Hundreds of Muskogee people traveled to their ancestral homeland in the South for their 30th annual Okmulgee celebration. Almost 200 years ago, the Muskogee people were forcibly removed from their lands. They were taken to Oklahoma. This caused much trauma for the tribal nation, something Principal Chief David Hill explained with tears in his eyes.
We always asked before, such a beautiful place, why did you leave? We weren't asked to leave, we was forced to leave.
Now Muskogee people are pushing for their sacred Okmulgee mounds to be turned into a national park. That idea has gained some traction. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland's agency is currently undergoing a federal review of the action, and she could soon ask Congress to create Okmulgee National Park. If approved, the park will include the mounds, nearly 900 sacred sites, and 54 river miles of floodplain. The tribal citizens say this would ensure not only the preservation of their land, but the cultural survival of their people.
There was a dehumanization about removal of those who were here. It was easier to live with yourself if we were savages and we were heathens and we were these awful people that needed to be removed and off this land so that, the world could survive, so this great story and this great nation could be built, but not acknowledging that there was already a nation here of people.
Local leaders also back the idea.
This project has enjoyed deep bipartisan, multi-jurisdictional political support. We have enjoyed support from our rural partners and our urban partners inside the Okmulgee corridor.
The Interior Department is expected to finish its review this fall. In Phoenix, Arizona, Pacey Smith-Garcia, ICT News.
Hurricanes, floods, and wildfires are symptoms of climate change. We watch the news and wonder what we can do on a personal level to make a difference. These are questions that Midwestern tribal nations will tackle on October 17th. The Wisconsin Academy will host a gathering called Climate Fast Forward. Its goal is to focus on solutions to protect these homelands. Dylan Jennings is the Associate Director of the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute.
Myself and Sarah Smith were another colleague of ours. Were asked to help to lead this track, which essentially would help to create just another network of like-minded individuals that need to get together from our tribal nations to talk about climate impacts, talk about our communities, and talk about a lot of these issues in common, but also share that these types of hardships that a lot of our communities experience, and a lot of these initiatives we're launching with the general public to raise awareness and to create bridges and synergy.
Jennings relates climate change to his home.
The food systems, our traditional food systems, which you'll often hear are, great preventative measure, health measure for combating a lot of the sicknesses and diseases that our communities are also disproportionately affected and impacted by. Our traditional food systems are just invaluable in general. Manoomin is one of those, wild rice. It's one of our very important staples that we rely upon, depend upon in our communities. And it's also, extremely, it can be very delicate and vulnerable to things like climate change as well.
That was Dylan Jennings. Last week was National Voter Registration Day. ICT's Sierra Alvarez reports.
This celebration is a civic event that has been occurring since 2012 to encourage people to get out and vote. There were many different vendors at this event in Phoenix, all with the same goal of registering people to vote. Some people got creative with their ideas. There was even a smoothie truck for participants. The event started off with a walk.
Nice leisurely walk.
Organizers say this is to recognize the connection between a healthy body and mind. This year, the Phoenix Indian Center, which was first started in 1947, followed the slogan, "The Power of the Native Vote."
Here in Arizona specifically, within the last major elections, there was a really great turnout from our Native voters, and we want to continue that momentum moving forward. Every person getting to the polls is extremely important.
T-shirts were also given to participants to showcase this idea. June Shorthair is the Civic Engagement Specialist at the Phoenix Indian Center.
You know, the past few years, if you look at the results, we've really made some strides. If you look at the numbers, not only within the state of Arizona, across the nation, and even at the reservation, their areas, they've also continued to increase.
There was a rally with speakers talking about the power of Native participation in the political process.
We all have opinions, and this is when it really matters. Your voice is your vote, and it is important to express how you feel and how you feel that we should be represented as a people.
In Phoenix, Arizona, Sierra Alvarez, ICT News.
According to Advanced Native Political Leadership, there are over 1 million Native people who are eligible to vote but are not registered. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.